Harry Don. After the rainy season had started in June, heavy rain that overwhelmingly exceeded the amount of rainfall in the previous year has continued in Pakistan, and in the result that caused serious flood disasters everywhere around Pakistan this time. So this is a really tragedy. This is a really shocking news for me. So the size of the land of Pakistan is twice bigger than that of Japan, but currently about 30% of the land of Pakistan is flooded, and about 33 million people suffered a great deal of damages of this disaster from this disaster, and more than 1,200 people were dead because of this disaster. So, and the damage of agriculture in Pakistan was significant. Especially cotton growing was actually catastrophic. So the direct cause of flood disaster that hit Pakistan this time is said to be increase of the amount of snowmelt water due to partial collapse of glacial lake by extreme temperature rise or greenhouse gas. So in Pakistan, there have been so many flood disasters because of no snow melt water from the glacial lake oftentimes before. But this time the amount of snow melt water was about 3 times more than that in the past. So extraordinary, amounts of extraordinary huge amounts of snow melt water came into flatland in Pakistan this time. So this was really horrified. So in response to the flood disaster this time in Pakistan, the United Nations just appealed the necessity of emergency fundraising about 160 million US dollars to member countries, and but disaster recovery assistance is facing rough going because most of the places in Pakistan are still flooded. So the federal minister of climate change, Senator Rahman in Pakistan, personally denounced the advanced countries that emit as much carbon dioxide as it occupies the greater part of the world total emissions amount. So she said the percentage of CO2 emissions in Pakistan is less than 1% of the world total emission amount. But she said we have no part in increase of greenhouse gas in the world, on the earth. The huge amount of CO2 emissions by advanced countries changed the world into the hell on the earth. So according to the statistics of countrywide CO2 emissions percentage, China is 28.4%, and United States is 14.7%, and India is 6.9%, and Russia is 4.97%, and Japan is 3.2%, and Germany is 2.1%. So the sum of percentage of top 3 CO2 emission countries is almost 50% of total world CO2 emission amounts, and the sum of percentage of top 6 CO2 emission countries exceeds half amounts of the world's CO2 emissions, which is about 60%. So it is obvious that majority of world total CO2 emissions amount is occupied by advanced countries, as she said. But if we use common sense, the energy consumption amount is in proportion to the size of economy of the country. So even if the country ratify the Paris Agreement, its CO2 emission reduction targets tends to be set to more realistic value because countries want to take great priority to activating economy over investing time to make effort to reduce CO2 emissions. So there are so many cases that the amount of CO2 emissions from advanced countries tends to remain at the same level compared to the year when they decided the emission reduction target. And there are also some cases that some countries give the rise of the amount of CO2 emissions compared to the year that decide emission reduction targets. So in the Paris Agreement, emission trading system was introduced to maintain incentives of ratifiers of the Paris Agreement towards CO2 emission reduction. So emission trading is something like a country buys as much achieved emission reduction value as emission reduction amount that didn't reach its target from the country that reduced CO2 emissions that exceeded the original target amount. So in a country let's target that wasn't achieved be achieved by taking advantage of the system of emission trading. So in this way, ratifiers of the Paris Agreement would make the story to seem coherent, as if every ratifier of the Paris Agreement achieved original CO2 emission targets. So, but there is a certain contradiction in this emission trading system. So, like rich countries can buy a lot of emission rights for excess amounts of achieved CO2 reduction from the country that achieved. So, in other words, advanced countries can get the right of CO2 emission. So, what I mean, like, what these countries do is no different from getting endorsements. Like you're allowed to emit CO2 on the Earth from the Paris Agreement. So ultimately, paying money for not achieved reduction amount forcibly change the fact not achieved to the fact of achieved. So there are so many contradictions in this emission trading system. So anyways, this emission trading system is no longer used to evoke the necessity of CO2 emission reduction from advanced countries. So CO2 emission reduction and economic activation is definitely antinomy and trade-off ultimately. For countries that aim for economic growth, CO2 emission reduction is quite obstructive concept, I think. So unless the world denies the capitalism and the economic growth, it is almost impossible for the world to reach the CO2 emission standard that the Paris Agreement envisions.